Today's topic is InfoBurst. What's that all about? And what's that funky little icon he's got over there? Let's talk a little bit about this. Before I dive in, we have to kind of go back and set a foundation before, and I promise I won't bore you for the next 20 minutes on the project lifecycle. It's key though. So let's unravel that a little bit and look at the main points, because what we're going to talk about is risk, potential points of failure, which is risk, how to identify them, where we can get help, and what to do with them. So I can't take credit for this picture. This is from a Chilean minister of finance and academic. His name is Fernando Flores. Talked about the atom of work. And there's a whole cycle here about customer satisfaction originally. There's an assessment. And it's really, it's the idea people, the visionary people's identifying a shortcoming and a need. And then as we go around the top half of the diagram is really about the customers concerned and making granular identification of specific things. So from an idea, how do we get it to the point where you can communicate it, you can quantify it, you can put a price, you can make decisions around it. And then as we loop around on the diagram, we get into the provider zone. And the provider, you set a firm commitment on price and time. Maybe you don't. Depends on the type of organization you're in, what type of work. This little pie in the corner is really the whole performance. That's where we execute. We say we're done, and then we roll it back into the organization, and we call that return to operations or operational commissioning. PMI, Project Management Institute, talks a whole lot about this and some about this. Now my experience, and maybe it's just the type of projects I've worked on, I've worked in healthcare and quite a bit of public sector, my experience is we do this part really well. Not nearly as good in here. And this is the whole atom of work that cycles back at the very end. The customer confirms that indeed we did solve the problem in the project as he rolls it back into operations. And the visionary people, they're 12 steps ahead and they're thinking of new things, but the project people have to mop it up. So 20, 30 years ago when PMI really got rolling, they took a scalpel, made an incision, and then rolled this whole thing out into our life cycle. And you guys have all seen these. These are, I mean, the standard, you may have slightly different words, but again, it goes from an idea, is it feasible, a sort of a go, no-go decision, all the planning, all the implementation, closing, and if we think of that other dimension, we roll it back into customer satisfaction, operational commissioning. Does that make sense? You guys have seen this before. Depending on what role we're in and where we're trained, we'll spend a whole bunch of time in a couple of those zones. Sometimes we get tossed out, and if you're a service provider, show of hands here, who here's a service provider and does contract work, especially for public sector? So 20–25% of you. If you're project managers and service provider, you probably spend most of your time just in this quadrant, just in implementation. Show of hands of people who regularly think, oh, I wish I'd got involved sooner because we could have steered it and made it more efficient. Yeah, that's about the first 15 years of Ralph's career too. Until I started working in that early zone, and it was a lot harder than I thought. Anyway, that's for another day. Contractors, service providers are in this window, they slide over, and then sometimes on the operational side, they have to come back, fix some things up, and sometimes we have to mop up where the owner or the client didn't do a really great job. So just think of this orange pie as spreading and swinging around wherever the focus is. That would be a good graphic someday. Maybe I should produce one of those. The points of weakness are the handoffs. And it's for a couple of reasons. One, it's about people. Could be organizations, And at the handoff, that's where you start to spend real money. So the idea grows to a set of specifications. The set of specifications grows. That becomes a real service provider. And in some industries, and here's the idea of the InfoBurst, is that those handoffs are really well defined and really obvious. In some other industries, we are making it up as we go. We are improving. And how do you know ahead of time if those channels or those handoffs are well defined? She knows that she's got a 10-yard zone or 10-meter zone in order to get up to speed and grab that baton and run like a maniac. But what if there were no rules? What if they were swimming? What if instead of a baton handoff, she had a beehive with a bunch of hornets coming out? Different set of rules. This is nicely fixed, and you can rehearse and practice that. So this is what it would look like from a large hospital construction project. Just a different view. So we got up over here at this end, these are the visionaries again. The ideas, and I sort of tease them sometimes, I call them, well, you guys are just the PowerPoint people. You guys have some ideas and some really clever language, and you sell, and it's important. But at least they've got to be on the same page and close enough that these folks over here, this is all your functional programmers, your architects, engineers, spec writers. These are all the guys that take this idea, put it in a form that a whole bunch of the population can digest it. And there's a set of arrows here. In construction, it's really, really, really common. We know that you unroll some drawings, they're always the same. You got key plans and site plans, then you got some elevations and details, and it kind of rolls out, and people, these guys, know exactly where to look. In some other industries, it's not so well defined. So if we look at these red arrows, then the folks are over here doing all the work. They're doing the work of the project. They're solving these people's problem. They're solving it. They're getting paid for it. It's satisfying if you do it once and the communication works well. Not so much if you got to go around and around and do it over. But eventually, the output of that work has to become transition to operations. And sometimes what these people write and define and draw, what we actually produce is not quite the same. So you got to capture all those learnings. We could have had equipment that was specified 2-3 years in advance by these guys to the best of their ability, that's discontinued, and by the time you get over to here, it's the next model over. Any healthcare people in here? Yeah, if you have to buy an MRI, or you buy, I worked on a couple of cancer care projects, a linear accelerator. Try and find getting approval early on when you really need it because there's a project deadline. It all happens after there's a big medical equipment show in Vegas, happens every November, and these guys are going to make sure that their best people are on board, go to that show, and I want the model 15,000 ZY. So it doesn't work to our timeline project, but they are protecting the interests of the final operations group. Does that kind of make sense? So we got red arrows are the bursts. We've got some blue arrows are the contractions, where a whole bunch of people may have made some changes, may have some really good learnings that would help operations, and if we're smart, we capture those learnings in documents and do a knowledge transfer down to the folks who are finally using it. So a little bit different view with people, but we're taking this life cycle and considering those channels. Let's think of another example. Anybody here military, or maybe you've got a spouse or a parent? I was at Remembrance Day celebrations here on the 11th, of course, and thinking of all the folks and what maybe some of our veterans, the technology changes, the organizational changes that they would have seen in their life? Yeah, there's a few. And they're a little bit different, aren't they? They have a special way of dealing with these red arrows and blue arrows. And that way is 100% compliance, or bad things happen to you. When this one tells you, and they got more stripes on their shoulders than these ones, they tell you what to do, you do it. That's how the military got over managing these different arrows. That's how they do it. Little historical example I have on my bedside table there. I've got a book I picked up. It shows before they were great, leaders like there's Winston Churchill and Napoleon, and it tells in about 10 pages some little fun facts about them before they got to the really famous part. And one that came to mind was Hannibal of Carthage. Hannibal of Carthage, anybody, you know what I'm talking about? What was Hannibal famous for? He marched the elephants across the Alps. Anything else that was special about Hannibal? He's actually known for a bunch of really, really good quotations. Hannibal was the one who first said, if you pay them peanuts, you're going to get monkeys. And he said a whole bunch of other things about leadership. So he had a way of dealing with these red arrows. If we think of one of these epic movies from the 60s, and there's Roman legions on one side, and there's 40,000 soldiers, and horses and chariots, and then you got the other side that has 20,000 soldiers. Hannibal was the underdog a lot, the way history records it, and sometimes had to inspire all of his soldiers over here in a heartbeat. He spoke 4 languages, so besides being a military genius, he was a fantastic communicator. He could get through the InfoBursts and was able to inspire people to keep that going. Thank you. So, arrows are the weak links. In a construction project, and I apologize for the small font, we'll call them the artifacts that we create are already well defined. And we have over here, the idea people produce functional block diagrams. The engineers and architects produce drawings and specs. These people produce as-built documentation. And then what do we need to run the project, to run in operations? Are manuals, warranties, systems verifications, all those sorts of things. IT project, not quite as mature, but we're doing a whole lot better. If we had this project talk 6 or 7 years ago, subject matter experts, trainers, user acceptance training, there'd still be lots of debate about that stuff. And now we're a lot more mature, and large organizations have their standards, so service providers know what to work to. This is maybe a little bit closer to the Hannibal problem, where it had to give a speech, inspires generals, lieutenants, and now that had to get communicated to thousands. Where we did a healthcare project, a greenfield hospital, did not know what these channels would look like, so they're darn blank. How many folks are in the Agile community and are either thinking about it or actually done some real work with Agile? All these points, these information bursts, information contractions or consolidations, let's think about how mature are those? And in Agile, that was one of the very, very first things that they defined. They saw that problem, and that's why we have a Kanban chart, and we talk about the stand-up meeting or the daily scrum. They addressed that on day 1 in response to this noticeable shortfall. So in businesses where communication artifacts are not mature, not widely utilized, whose job is it now to validate and make sure that those red arrows especially, and somewhat the blue arrows, that we have convergence and that the baton handoffs, that they understand each other? Project managers, sponsors, PMO, my experience, it's usually, I thought you had that. I thought you had that. We hired the best project manager that we could find. But you know what? They're not familiar with our organization, and they use different labels. So what the hospital folks did is their answer was, we need people with hospital experience. We don't know what these labels are, but if you work in the business, if you work in the profession for years and years, you get that nuance, and that's how they fill that in. So that's how they get around it. It would be nice if we had a little more standardization, but if we don't, the PM who's in charge of all communications has to at least be aware that there's a potential shortfall. So what do? We include for the development of documentation channels and artifacts, I call them. And those will be organization specific. It's really, really hard if we have joint ventures. Metrolinx, anybody here from Metrolinx? People that are working maybe on a large government IT upgrades, those sorts of things, where it's multiple organizations, they have to work together. You have to actually develop those standards, and it's a huge risk if one doesn't acknowledge that. Allow time and money. Allow time and money. We've all been through user acceptance testing. Got to make the deadline, it gets shorter, shorter. Wow, what if our channels aren't even set up? What if we don't even have the same documentation? And international projects, don't even get me started on that one. We just assume because you've worked in finance or because you've worked in healthcare or whatever that we make these communication bursts and contractions, we know how to do it. We have to test it. I like to run little samples, dress rehearsals, and then validate over and over again. And it's actually a pretty safe place for a PM to turn to his or her sponsor and say, I'm not sure that the communication is working. Help me with this. So it's a nice way to engage the organization pretty deeply without looking vulnerable yourself or looking like you don't know how to do your work. It's separate than the actual project delivery. Okay? Hope that helps. Run lots of little rehearsals, validate, and we want to really use our sponsors. If your sponsor's in the organization, there's nothing more important that you can do to help your team in order to succeed.